A baby's heart suddenly stops in the middle of the night. Doctors rush to the scene, alarms blaring. Yet none of their efforts seem to make a difference. Just as the medical team begins to lose hope, a golden retriever steps forward, quietly approaching the cradle. In a world dominated by science, this dog is about to defy everything they believe to be true. At St. Adrian's Hospital, the night was calm, with nurses and doctors performing their usual tasks as patients watched their screens. Yet, amidst the quiet, something unusual occurred. A golden retriever named Charlie walked with determination through the hospital's automatic doors, entering without being noticed. His golden fur glistened under the harsh fluorescent lights, his soft brown eyes wide with focus. No one questioned his presence, perhaps assuming he was a therapy dog, or maybe a stray who wandered too far from home. But Charlie wasn't aimlessly wandering. His movements were precise, as if he knew exactly where he needed to go. He padded through the sterile halls, his nails clicking lightly against the floor. A nurse, weary from her shift, spotted him but said nothing, letting out a tired sigh instead. Charlie continued undeterred, his destination clear: the neonatal intensive care unit, where tiny lives clung to machines, struggling for every breath. Inside one of the glass chambers, a baby lay, fragile and still, tubes and wires connecting her small body to the machines that kept her alive. Charlie's eyes softened as he looked through the window. He nudged the door open with his nose and slipped inside, unnoticed. With a motion so delicate it felt deliberate, Charlie positioned himself beside the baby's crib, curling up as close as the medical equipment permitted. The steady beeping of the baby's heart monitor softened ever so slightly, barely noticeable, but undeniable. The enigma only deepened. Why had Charlie come? How did he know to be there? And why did his presence seem to bring such peace to the baby? As the hours dragged on, the nurses continued their rounds, unaware of the quiet bond forming in the ICU. The baby's heart rate, once erratic, steadied. The machines beeped steadily now, signaling small but noticeable improvements. Outside the ICU, Nurse Grace sighed deeply, rubbing her eyes. It had been a long shift, and she was tired, emotionally and physically. She had spent the last few months caring for this frail infant, watching helplessly as the baby's condition fluctuated between moments of hope and despair. But tonight felt different. Something about the air seemed lighter, less oppressive. As she leaned against the nurse's station, a thought tugged at the back of her mind. Something was off. She stood up, deciding to check on the baby one more time before her shift ended. Grace stepped into the ICU, her eyes immediately drawn to the golden shape curled up beside the crib. She blinked, startled. There, lying peacefully beside the baby, was Charlie, the retriever she'd seen earlier. At first, her instinct was to shoo him away, to call security and remove him from the sterile environment. But something held her back. The baby's vital signs were steady for the first time in days. The realization struck her hard. Was it just a coincidence, or was the dog somehow helping? A memory from her past flashed briefly in her mind. Her own child, now a teenager, had once been in the ICU as well. In those desperate times, she would have clung to anything that offered even a faint hope. Even the quiet presence of a dog. Pushing the thought aside, she moved cautiously toward the crib. Charlie raised his head as Grace approached, his gaze calm and unwavering. He wasn't causing any harm. If anything, the baby seemed improved, resting more peacefully. Grace's heart ached with a sudden flood of emotions: hope, disbelief, and an unsettling sense of wonder. She knelt beside the crib, reaching out to gently touch the baby's hand. The tiny fingers twitched under her touch, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary dog, and this was no ordinary night. Without understanding why, Grace let Charlie stay. Something about him felt right, like he belonged here, in this moment, by this child's side. She stood up, glancing at the heart monitor once more, which now beat with a reassuring steadiness. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something she could explain, not yet. As the night wore on, Grace stayed close, her eyes flicking between the sleeping dog and the fragile infant. What connection existed between them, she didn't know. But for the first time in weeks, a spark of hope flared in her chest. Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond her understanding was happening. The way Charlie had appeared at the hospital, unnoticed by staff, slipping into the ICU as if he belonged there, it was too strange to ignore. She leaned against the window, staring at the city lights below, her mind racing with thoughts that danced between logic and intuition. Her gaze returned to the baby, whose condition had been so fragile. How many times had she stood helplessly by, watching as machines did what they could to keep the child alive? But tonight something felt different. Was it the dog's presence? Could such a thing even be possible? Grace's mind drifted to her own past, memories she had long buried, refusing to confront them for years. Years ago, she had stood in a similar place, watching over her son as he lay in a hospital bed, fighting to survive a severe asthma attack. The fear had been overwhelming, the helplessness suffocating, consuming every corner of her being. She remembered sitting beside him, praying for anything that would make him better. In those moments of desperation, she had been willing to believe in miracles. Her son had pulled through, but the emotional scars of those nights had never fully healed. Grace glanced at Charlie, who was now softly resting his head on his paws, his eyes occasionally flickering open to check on the baby. The calmness in his demeanor was almost surreal. Grace knelt down beside him, gently placing a hand on his back. The warmth of his fur beneath her fingers grounded her. For a moment, she didn't need answers, only to trust her instincts, which were telling her to let Charlie stay. The hospital staff, though initially doubtful, started to accept Charlie's presence. At first, there were quiet complaints about the dog venturing into restricted areas, and a few doctors voiced their concerns. However, Grace became his quiet advocate, proposing that perhaps, just perhaps, his presence was playing a role in the child's recovery. The staff, though initially hesitant, noticed the baby's gradual improvement and begrudgingly agreed to let Charlie stay, at least for now. As the days passed, a strange yet unspoken bond formed between Grace and Charlie. It wasn't just the quiet companionship of a nurse and a dog. It was something deeper. Every night, Grace found herself looking forward to seeing Charlie. She'd sit beside him, sometimes talking in hushed tones about her day, other times simply resting her head against the edge of the baby's crib. The weight of the world seemed to lift, even if just temporarily, by the dog's quiet presence. Charlie's loyalty never wavered. He stayed close to the baby, never venturing far from the crib. And as Grace grew closer to the dog, she couldn't help but notice subtle shifts in her own emotions. The grief she had long carried for her son's near-death experience seemed to ease in Charlie's presence. The calmness he exuded was infectious, bringing her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Their dynamic became a quiet ritual. Each night, Grace would check in on the baby, making sure everything was stable before sitting down next to Charlie. And every night, Charlie would lift his head, watching her with those soft, knowing eyes, as if he understood her in ways no one else could. In those silent moments, the hospital became more than just a sterile environment. It became a place where unlikely bonds could form, where a dog could change everything without uttering a single word. Though no one could explain the baby's progress, Grace knew that Charlie had something to do with it. He wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline, and she was no longer willing to let him go. As days turned into weeks, Charlie became a familiar sight in the ICU, a quiet yet constant companion. Grace's subtle advocacy ensured his continued presence, but the situation was growing more complex. The hospital wasn't meant to shelter a stray, and eventually the administration began to take notice. Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. Dr. Carter, a senior physician renowned for his unwavering commitment to protocol, was the first to officially question Charlie's presence in the ICU. "This is a hospital, not a kennel," Dr. Carter said one afternoon, his voice sharp as he confronted Grace in the break room. "I've heard the stories, but we can't base medical decisions on superstition or sentimentality." Grace tensed, feeling the weight of her responsibility to both the hospital and the child. She understood Dr. Carter's perspective. After all, hospitals ran on data and regulations. But Charlie was different. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that his presence was tied to the baby's survival. "Every time Charlie is by the crib, the baby's condition stabilizes," Grace said, her voice steady yet imploring. "Every time he leaves, the monitors show signs of distress. You've seen the charts, Dr. Carter. You know the baby is improving, and Charlie is part of it. We can't just ignore that." Dr. Carter crossed his arms, unmoved. "There's no evidence that a dog can heal a patient. We're removing him today. End of discussion." Grace's heart sank. She knew the hospital's hands were tied by rules, but this wasn't just about protocols anymore. It was about life and death, about unseen connections that went beyond medical textbooks. As Dr. Carter left, Grace sat down, overwhelmed with a sense of helplessness. Charlie was her last hope for the baby, and now that hope was slipping away. The day Charlie was scheduled to be removed from the hospital was tense. Grace arrived early, trying to stay professional, but her hands trembled as she worked. She hadn't had the courage to tell anyone about Charlie's fate. The baby's health was once again in decline, and the anxiety in the ICU was palpable. The machines, which had remained steady for days, now emitted irregular beeps, a distress signal no one could overlook. Grace hurried to check on the baby, knowing it might be her final chance before Charlie was removed. When she arrived at the crib, Charlie was already there, lying motionless, his gaze steady and fixed on the child. It was as though he understood what was happening, and the thought of him being taken away shattered Grace's heart. Suddenly, the baby's heart monitor let out a sharp, continuous beep. Flatline. The room filled with alarms as nurses rushed in, but the scene froze as Grace stood there, watching Charlie rise from his spot. He approached the crib, nudging the baby's tiny hand with his nose. And then, as if by some unseen force, the monitor stuttered back to life. Slowly, steadily, the baby's heart rate returned. The room fell silent. Grace's breath caught in her throat as she watched, hardly believing her own eyes. The staff exchanged stunned glances, their medical training unable to explain what had just occurred. Dr. Carter, who had come to oversee Charlie's removal, stood in the doorway, frozen in place. His skepticism was shaken, but he still wasn't convinced. "We can't keep him here, based on this," Dr. Carter muttered, though his voice had lost its usual firmness. Grace knew this was no coincidence. Something bigger was at play, something none of them could fully grasp. Charlie returned to his spot by the crib, calm and unmoving. Grace realized that the dog wasn't just a visitor. He was a part of the baby's fight for survival, and removing him now could mean the end for both of them. The turning point had arrived. Grace knew she had to act quickly. The tension in the ICU was palpable, every eye shifting between Charlie, the baby, and Dr. Carter, who stood firm but visibly conflicted. Security guards arrived at the door, their presence a stark reminder of the rules Grace was breaking. She knelt beside Charlie, positioning herself between him and the guards, her hands trembling but steadying as she placed them on his back. "Please, don't do this," she pleaded, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've all seen the baby's progress. It's real. I don't care if there's no scientific explanation. Charlie is helping. You can't take him away." The room grew quiet, her heartfelt words lingering in the air. For a brief moment, Dr. Carter's expression softened, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. But he quickly steeled himself, his voice firm and unwavering. "We have protocols, Grace," he said, his tone resolute. "This isn't about belief or sentimentality. We need evidence, and there's none to support this." Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but her voice steadied. "Then I'll take full responsibility. If anything goes wrong, it's on me. But I can't stand by and let that baby die when I know, deep in my gut, that Charlie is the reason she's still alive." The weight of her words filled the room, and for a long, tense moment no one moved. Dr. Carter sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose as he processed the situation. Finally, he muttered, "One more night. But this is your responsibility, Grace. If this goes south, it's on you." Relief washed over Grace, and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you," she whispered. The guards stood down, and the ICU slowly returned to its usual hum of activity, though the tension lingered. Grace sat by Charlie's side, her hand resting on his fur as the baby's monitor beeped steadily. That night, Grace stayed vigilant, watching over the baby and Charlie. The hours crept by, the weight of the day pressing on her, but she refused to leave. As the first light of dawn crept into the ICU, something extraordinary happened. The baby, whose condition had been critical for so long, opened her eyes for the first time. Grace gasped, her heart leaping in her chest. She immediately called for the doctors, who rushed in, disbelief etched across their faces as they observed the baby. The child's tiny chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, her vitals stronger than they had been in weeks. Charlie, still lying beside the crib, lifted his head, his brown eyes meeting Grace's. There was something knowing in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement that his work was done. The doctors ran tests, searching for a medical explanation for the baby's sudden improvement. But no matter how many tests they performed, they couldn't account for the dramatic turnaround. Dr. Carter, once skeptical, stood in silence, his expression unreadable. Though he didn't say a word, the weight of his doubt seemed to lift, replaced by a faint glimmer of wonder. A few days later, the baby was transferred out of the ICU, her condition no longer critical. Charlie, sensing the change, stood up from his place beside the crib. He nudged Grace's hand one last time, his gentle eyes lingering on her before he padded out of the room. Grace watched him go, her heart filled with gratitude and sadness. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but one thing was certain. Charlie had been there when it mattered most, offering a kind of healing that went beyond medicine. As the hospital settled back into its usual routines, Grace often found herself reflecting on the extraordinary events of the past weeks. The connection between Charlie and the baby, though impossible to explain, had been undeniable. Sometimes, she realized, not everything needed to be understood. Some experiences were meant to be felt, not rationalized. Months later, Standing by the hospital window and gazing at the bustling city streets below, Grace's thoughts turned to Charlie. She wondered where he might be now, what new purpose he could be fulfilling. A gentle smile crossed her face. Miracles, she now believed, came in many forms. Some as profound as a baby's recovery, and others as simple as the quiet companionship of a dog. Did you enjoy this story? Do you believe that dogs have the power to save our lives? Let us know in the comments below. If you like the story, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like. Dogs love us unconditionally, often more deeply than we love ourselves. Would you agree? Thank you so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.